They put a number under her name and called it an auction lot, unaware that the man walking through that door owned every syndicate in the room and had spent 3 years trying to find her. The ballroom of the Grand Yan Hotel in Gangnam glittered like a cage built from crystal. Chandeliers threw gold light across marble floors, polished so clean they looked wet. Waiters in black vests moved between round tables draped in white linen, pouring champagne into glasses that caught the light and scattered it like broken diamonds. Somewhere above the string quartet, a chandelier the size of a small car swayed almost imperceptibly, and nobody in that room would have guessed that within the hour it would witness the collapse of 3 empires and the return of a man they all believed had lost the ability to feel anything at all. Kang Tae-min stood at the edge of the room with his hands in his pockets, his tailored charcoal suit fitting him like a second skin stitched from money and violence. He was 34 years old, 6'2", with black hair combed back and a jaw that could cut glass. A thin white scar ran from his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone, a souvenir from the night his own uncle tried to have him killed at 19 and failed. He wore it the way other men wore medals. His eyes were the color of wet asphalt, flat and unreadable, and when he looked at a room, the room usually looked away first. He was the current chairman of the Baekho Syndicate, the largest underworld network stretching from the docks of Busan to the glass towers of Seoul, though on paper he was simply the CEO of Kang Holdings, a shipping and logistics conglomerate that laundered more money in a single fiscal quarter than most nations collected in taxes. 3 years earlier, the press had called him the ghost heir, the boy who vanished from the throne his father built. Tonight, they would finally learn why he came back. He was not there for the charity. He was not there for the champagne or the string quartet playing something borrowed from Vivaldi. He was there because his assistant, a nervous man named Jun-ho who had learned never to lie to his boss, had called him 40 minutes earlier with a tremor in his voice that Tae-min had never heard before. "Sir, lot number 17, you need to see the catalog." He hadn't understood until he opened the file himself, sitting in the back of his black Genesis limousine as it cut through Gangnam traffic like a blade through silk. A single photograph, a single name, Daisy Bellamy Reyes, 29 years old, American, formerly of Busan. The charity auction organizers had listed her as a companionship lot, a dinner date with a rising local celebrity chef, all proceeds to benefit an orphanage in Incheon. It was framed as harmless. It was framed as generous. But Tae-min had stared at that photograph until the car stopped moving. Because 3 years earlier, this woman had disappeared from his life without a word, without a note, without a single goodbye, and he had spent 3 years and an obscene amount of money trying to find out why. Now she stood beneath the chandeliers in a green silk dress that moved like water when she shifted her weight, her dark curls pinned back from a face Tae-min had memorized in every version of every dream he had had for 1100 nights. She was not thin. She had never been thin. She was broad-shouldered and soft and solid, built like a woman who had survived things, with a warmth in her brown eyes that used to be the only warmth he ever let himself feel. 3 years had changed nothing about the way his chest tightened when he saw her, and everything about the fear he saw flickering behind her smile as the auctioneer called her lot number. Lot 17, ladies and gentlemen. An evening with Chef Daisy Reyes, celebrated pastry artist of the Marigold Kitchen. Do I hear an opening bid of 2 million won? A man near the front raised his paddle, then another. The bidding climbed, and Tae-min watched her stand there with her chin lifted and her hands folded in front of her, like a woman standing before a firing squad and refusing to flinch. He knew that posture. He had recognized it the very first week he met her, back when she was a broke culinary student working double shifts at a noodle stall near the Busan waterfront, and he was a masked stranger bleeding from a knife wound, and she had pulled him into her tiny apartment and stitched him up with a sewing needle and a bottle of soju because she said no one, criminal or saint, deserved to bleed out alone in an alley. She did not know he was there. He intended to keep it that way for exactly 90 more seconds, long enough to understand what game was being played and who was playing it, because Taemin had not survived 3 assassination attempts and 1 boardroom coup by acting before he understood the board. The bidding stalled at 11 million won when a voice cut through the room, smooth and cold as a blade dipped in ice water. 50 million. Every head turned. Taemin recognized the man immediately, a broad-shouldered figure in a navy suit with silver cufflinks shaped like scorpions. Choi Min-jae, second son of the Choi family, heir apparent to the Red Talon Syndicate, the only organization in the country that had ever dared challenge Baeko territory. Min-jae smiled the way a shark smiles, all teeth and no warmth, and Taemin felt something old and violent uncoil in his chest, a feeling he thought he had buried the night he walked away from all of this 3 years earlier. 50 million won was not a bid for a dinner date. 50 million won was a message. Daisy's face had gone pale beneath the stage lights, her jaw tight, her eyes darting toward the exit before she caught herself and forced her spine straight again. Taemin remembered teaching her that trick. The night he found her crying behind a dumpster after her restaurant's landlord tried to evict her for being 3 days late on rent. "Chin up," he had told her, resting his palm against the back of her neck. "Let them see you're not afraid even when you are. Fear is a language they speak fluently. Don't give them the satisfaction of hearing you stutter in it." The auctioneer cleared his throat, visibly rattled by the sum. 50 million won, going once. Taemin stepped forward, and the crowd parted the way crowds always parted for him. Some ancient animal instinct recognizing an apex predator before the conscious mind caught up. He did not raise a paddle, he did not need one. He simply said, in a voice pitched to carry across marble and crystal and 300 whispering socialites, 100 million. The room went silent enough to hear the string quartet's bows scrape against catgut. Daisy's eyes found him across the ballroom, and for 1 full second, Taemin watched 3 years of careful composure shatter across her face like a dropped teacup. Her lips parted, her hand rose halfway to her mouth before she caught it and forced it back down to her side, and in that single, unguarded second, he saw everything he needed to see. Not indifference, not the cold rejection he had convinced himself she must have felt, the only explanation he could accept for why a woman who once told him she loved him more than she loved her own stubborn pride would vanish in the night without a word. What he saw instead was grief. Raw, undiluted, 3 years aged grief, staring back at him from across a room full of strangers who had no idea they were watching 2 ghosts recognize each other. 100 million won, going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Kang Taemin. Applause rippled through the ballroom, polite and confused, because half the guests did not understand what they had just witnessed, and the other half understood it perfectly and were already reaching for their phones to text their families that the ghost heir had resurfaced, and he had resurfaced for her. Choi Min-jae's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he schooled his face back into pleasant boredom, but Taemin caught it, filed it away the way he filed away every flicker of weakness in every rival he had ever crushed. He would deal with Min-jae later. Right now, there was only one thing in that room worth his attention, and she was walking toward the edge of the stage on unsteady legs, looking at him like he was either a rescue or an ambush, and she could not yet tell which. He met her at the base of the small stairs. Up close, she smelled the same, vanilla and cardamom, and the faint burnt sugar smell that never fully washed out of a pastry chef's skin, no matter how many showers she took. His hands ached with the memory of holding her face the last time he saw her, the night before she disappeared, when she had kissed him at 3 in the morning in his penthouse kitchen, and told him she would see him tomorrow, a promise she broke so completely it took a piece of him with it that he never fully got back. "Hello, Daisy." Her chin lifted, that same stubborn, defiant tilt he had taught her, except now he understood it was not just armor against strangers. It was armor against him. "You shouldn't have done that. I would do it 1,000 times. I would do it for the rest of my life if it meant I never had to watch that man's name get attached to yours again." Around them, 300 pairs of eyes watched a man the tabloids called the ghost heir reach out and, in front of God, cameras, and the entire elite of Seoul's underworld, cup the face of a woman he had not touched in 3 years and kiss her like the last 3 years had never happened at all. Her hands fisted in the lapels of his jacket, and for 3 full seconds she kissed him back with a desperation that answered every question he had been asking himself since the night she vanished, before her palms flattened against his chest, and she shoved him back, breathing hard, eyes wet, and whispered the words that would detonate everything he thought he understood about why she left. "You don't understand what you just did. You just put a target on both our backs, Taemin. He's going to kill me now. He was always going to kill me. That's why I left." The chandeliers kept glittering. The quartet, unsure what else to do, kept playing. And somewhere in the crowd, Choi Min-jae smiled at his own champagne glass, because the game he had been playing for 3 years had just become infinitely more interesting. 3 years earlier, Busan had smelled like salt and diesel, and the particular sweetness of frying dough that clung to every alley near the Gukja market. Daisy Bellamy Reyes was 26 years old, 6 months into a culinary apprenticeship that paid almost nothing, sharing a studio apartment above a laundromat with a mattress on the floor and a hot plate she used to practice her caramel technique until the smoke alarm became background noise to her neighbors. She had left Ohio at 22 with a culinary school scholarship and a stubborn refusal to become the kind of woman her mother wanted her to be, small and quiet and apologetic for the space she took up in the world. In Busan, nobody cared what size dress she wore. They cared whether her hands could turn sugar into glass and butter into poetry. And for the first time in her life, Daisy discovered that her body was simply the vehicle that carried her talent, not the headline of her existence. The night she met Kang Tae-min, she was closing up the noodle stall where she worked nights to cover rent, wiping down steel counters under a buzzing fluorescent light, when a man stumbled into the narrow alley behind her building with blood soaking through his white dress shirt and a look in his eyes like a wolf that had just realized it was dying. She did not know, that night, that he was the heir to the Baeko syndicate, ambushed by his own cousin's men in a dispute over dock territory. She only knew a man was bleeding and afraid to go to a hospital, muttering something about needing to disappear for a few hours, and something in her chest, the same reckless kindness that had gotten her in trouble her entire life, would not let her walk past him. She pulled him inside. She locked the door. She boiled water on her hot plate and threaded a sewing needle with dental floss, because it was the closest thing to suture thread she owned, and she stitched a 4-inch gash closed in his side while he gritted his teeth and stared at her like she was the strangest, bravest thing he had ever seen. "You're not going to ask who did this to me," he had said. "Would you tell me the truth if I asked?" "No." "Then I'm not wasting the question." He laughed, a short surprise sound like it had been startled out of him, and something in Taemin that had been frozen since he was 19 years old and watched his own blood family try to kill him for a shipping route began slowly to thaw. He came back to her stall 3 nights later, still favoring his left side, carrying a paper bag of medical supplies and a bottle of good whiskey he set on her counter like an apology and a bribe rolled into one. He did not tell her his name that night either. He told her to call him Tae, and she did for 6 months, before a newspaper photograph of the Baeko Syndicate's new young chairman standing beside his father at a shipping gala made her realize exactly what kind of storm she had led into her small, sugar-scented life. By then, it no longer mattered. By then, she was already in love with him, helplessly, foolishly, the way a person falls in love with weather, unable to negotiate with something so much larger than themselves. He would appear at odd hours, sometimes with security trailing 2 blocks behind, pretending not to be there, and sit on an overturned crate in the alley behind her kitchen while she practiced spinning sugar into delicate amber threads. And he would watch her hands the way other men watch sports, transfixed, silent, something like reverence settling into the hard lines of his face. "You could do anything with those hands," he told her once. "Build empires, break hearts, bake bread that makes grown men cry. I just want to open my own bakery someday. Something small, something warm, somewhere nobody has to be afraid to walk in the door. He had gone very quiet at that, and she hadn't understood then that he was thinking of every door his own family had ever made people afraid to walk through, every debt collected in blood instead of currency, every territory line drawn with a knife instead of a signature. He never told her what he did in daylight hours. She never asked, not directly, though she was not naive. She had seen the scars. She had seen the men who trailed him at a respectful distance with wires in their ears. She had made her peace with not knowing the shape of the storm, only the eye of it, the strange calm he became whenever he sat across from her with flour on his sleeves because she had put him to work kneading dough, laughing at how badly the future chairman of an underworld empire handled a simple ball of brioche. He planted roses with her on the roof of her building, in cracked terracotta pots they bought from a street vendor for almost nothing, and told her that where he came from, roses meant something was worth protecting even when it was covered in thorns. She told him that in Ohio her grandmother used to say the same thing, except about people. He kissed her for the first time under a string of paper lanterns her landlord had strung up for a summer festival, and she felt, for the first time since she left America, like her body was not a subject for anyone's commentary, not too much, not too visible, simply hers, simply wanted, simply enough. For 18 months, it was the closest thing to peace either of them had ever known. The night everything broke was a Tuesday in late autumn, rain coming down in sheets over the Busan docks, when Daisy answered a knock at her apartment door expecting Tae-min, and found instead a woman she had never met, elegant and cold in a black coat, flanked by two men whose stillness radiated a violence more frightening than any shouting could have been. The woman introduced herself as Han Soo-jin, chief strategist of the Baeko syndicate, and the closest thing Tae-min's late mother ever had to a sister. "You will listen to me once, Miss Reyes, and then you will never see me again, provided you make the correct choice tonight," Soo-jin explained, in a voice so calm it was almost gentle, exactly what Daisy's presence in Tae-min's life was costing him. The Choi family, rivals for 3 generations, had learned of the relationship and were already using it, spreading word through the Underworld Council that the Baeko heir was weak, distracted, compromised by an American nobody with no family, no leverage, no protection, a soft target through which they could reach the only man standing between the Choi family and total dominance of the peninsula's shipping trade. There had already been one attempt, Soo-jin said, watching Daisy's face carefully. A car that had idled too long outside her building. A man who had been paid to make her disappear quietly, intercepted only because Tae-min's people were already watching her without her knowledge, protecting her from a danger she had never been told existed. "He will never choose the syndicate over you," Soo-jin said. "That is precisely the problem. He will burn his father's entire empire to ash to keep you safe, and men like Choi Min-jae know it, and they will keep coming for you, again and again, each attempt more violent than the last, until either you are dead or he is, because that is the only way this ends if you stay." Daisy had not slept that night. She sat on her narrow mattress with her knees pulled to her chest, watching rain streak down the window, and made the only decision that felt like love instead of cowardice. She packed one suitcase. She left the rose pots on the roof, watered, labeled with a note asking her landlord to keep them alive. She left no letter for Tae-min, because Soo-jin had warned her that any note, any goodbye, any lingering thread he could follow, would only give him a reason to chase her into a war he could not win while distracted by grief. She boarded a red-eye flight to a small coastal town outside Seoul, under a name that was not quite her own, and she let the only man she had ever loved wake up the next morning to an empty apartment and a silence he would spend 3 years trying to fill with an answer that made sense. What she did not know, what Soo-jin either did not know or chose not to say, was that the Choi family's interest in her never actually stopped. It simply went quiet, patient, waiting for the day she resurfaced, because Choi Min-jae had learned a lesson his father taught him young. You do not destroy your enemy's weakness. You collect it. You wait for the moment it becomes most valuable, and then you cash it in. 3 years is a long time to disappear inside a new name. Daisy rebuilt herself in the coastal town of Sokcho first, then later Seoul, working her way up from a dish station in a hotel kitchen to head pastry chef at the Marigold, a small, warmly lit restaurant near Ikseondong, known for turning traditional Korean flavors into architectural desserts that made grown businessmen weep quietly into their napkins. She told herself the ache in her chest was manageable, was survivable, was the cost of keeping a man she loved alive. She built a life out of butter and sugar and early mornings, and if sometimes a stranger's cologne on the subway made her stomach drop with a longing so sharp it stole her breath, she told herself that was simply what love left behind when you amputated it cleanly. A phantom limb, an ache with no cure. She did not know that Kang Tae-min had spent those same 3 years transforming from a reluctant heir into a full and merciless chairman, consolidating every scrap of power his father left behind, specifically so that no one, not the Choi family, not any rival council in the country, could ever again threaten someone he loved and survive the consequences. She did not know he had quietly funded a search that spanned 3 continents, following false leads through Los Angeles and Toronto and Manila before a chance sighting, a grainy photograph from a food blogger's post praising the Marigold's caramel and salt tart finally led his people back to Seoul, back to a woman baking under a name that was almost, but not quite, her own. She had thought herself safe in obscurity. She did not know that Choi Min-jae's people had found her 4 months before Kang Tae-min's people did, and that the charity auction lot with her photograph in it had not been an innocent oversight by well-meaning gala organizers. It had been engineered, purchased, orchestrated by the Choi family from the very first printed catalog, a trap built with patience and precision, designed to lure the ghost heir out of hiding by dangling the one bait in the world he could never resist. And in the ballroom of the Grand Hyun Hotel, standing in the wreckage of a kiss that had just detonated 3 years of careful silence, Daisy finally understood the truth Soo-jin had tried to warn her about a lifetime ago. Leaving had not protected him at all. It had only delayed the war, and bought the Choi family 3 additional years to prepare a battlefield of their own choosing. "Get me out of here," she whispered against his jaw, her fingers still curled into the fabric of his jacket. "Now, please, Taemin, before he decides he doesn't need the auction rules anymore." Taemin's hand found the small of her back, steering her through the parting crowd with a grip that was gentle and absolute at once, and behind them Choi Min-jae rose from his table unhurried, adjusting his silver cufflinks, watching the 2 of them go with the patient, satisfied expression of a man who had just watched his trap spring exactly as designed. "Let them run," he murmured to the man beside him. "Running only makes the fall more interesting." Outside, rain had begun to fall over Gangnam, streaking the neon signs into rivers of red and blue light across the wet pavement. Taemin's driver had the car waiting at the curb before they even cleared the revolving doors, and as he folded Daisy into the back seat, tucking his own jacket around her bare shoulders, he caught sight of 2 black sedans idling across the street that had not been there an hour ago, engines running, headlights off. He did not react outwardly. He had spent his entire adult life learning not to react outwardly, but his jaw tightened, and his hand found the phone in his breast pocket, and by the time the limousine pulled away from the curb, he had already sent the single-word text that would put every soldier in the Baeko syndicate on alert before midnight. Read, the penthouse at the top of Kang Tower occupied the entire 52nd floor, glass walls looking out over a Gangnam skyline smeared with rain, and it was the first place Daisy had stood in 3 years that still smelled faintly of him, cedar and gun oil, and the particular cold air of high floors. She stood at the window with his jacket still around her shoulders, watching the city blur into ribbons of light, while behind her Taemin spoke in low, clipped Korean to a man named Do-yoon, the head of his personal security detail, a compact, silent man with a burn scar across his knuckles, who had apparently been guarding her from a discreet distance for exactly 4 months, without her ever noticing. 4 months. She turned from the window, arms crossed over her chest, and repeated the number back to Tae-min like an accusation. "You've had people watching me for 4 months, and you didn't once say hello? I wasn't ready for you to run again. I didn't run because I wanted to. I know that now. I didn't know it then. 3 years is a long time to build a story in your head about why someone left, Daisy, and none of the stories I built were kind to you." Do-yoon cleared his throat, professionally unbothered by the tension crackling in the room, and delivered his report. The 2 sedans outside the hotel belonged to a Shell logistics company, traced back through 4 layers of paperwork to a warehouse the Choi family used for unregistered shipping near the Busan docks, the same docks where, 3 years earlier, a knife wound first brought Tae-min into Daisy's life. It was not a coincidence, Do-yoon said. Min-jae was sending a message. He wanted Tae-min to know exactly where this began, because he intended for it to end there too. The first blow landed within the hour. Tae-min's phone buzzed with a security alert from the Marigold, and by the time the footage loaded on his tablet, Daisy was already gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, watching grainy black and white surveillance video of 2 men in delivery uniforms entering her restaurant's storage room after close and dousing the pastry kitchen's dry goods shelf in accelerant before a silent alarm scared them off before they could strike the match. No one was hurt. The restaurant was untouched, saved by 6 seconds and a smoke detector wired directly to a private security firm Tae-min had quietly hired to watch it without her knowledge. But the message was unmistakable, spray-painted in red across the delivery door in Korean characters that even Daisy, with her limited fluency, could read without translation. "Return what you took, and this ends." "They didn't take anything from Min-jae," Daisy said, her voice shaking with a fury that surprised even her. "What is he even asking for?" "He's not asking for anything real. He's asking me to feel powerless. It's a tactic, not a negotiation. It's working. Look at my hands, Tae-min. I can't stop shaking." He crossed the kitchen and took both her hands in his, steady and warm despite everything, and for a moment the storm outside the glass wall seemed very far away. "I promise you, on my mother's grave, I will burn his entire operation to the ground before I let him touch one more thing that belongs to you." The second betrayal came from somewhere closer, somewhere it should never have been able to reach. 2 days later, Han Soo-jin, the same strategist who once stood in Daisy's doorway 3 years earlier and convinced her to disappear for love, requested a private meeting in Tae-min's office on the 40th floor of Kang Tower. And what she revealed there rearranged everything Daisy thought she understood about her own exile. "I need you to understand, I did what I believed was necessary," Soo-jin said, her hands folded in her lap, her composure a fortress even now. 3 years ago, the Choi family did not merely threaten Miss Reyes's life. They offered me something in exchange for delivering her fear to her doorstep and ensuring she disappeared quietly. A controlling stake in a shipping route my late husband spent his life building, one your father had promised to my family and then reneged on before his death. I told myself it was strategy. I told myself I was protecting the syndicate by removing a liability, but I was also settling an old score, and I used a frightened, kind young woman to do it. Tae-min's stillness in that moment was more frightening than any shout could ever have been, a stillness Daisy had only seen once before, the night 3 years earlier when she stitched a knife wound in his side and watched something in him decide, silently, permanently, that he would never again allow himself to be caught unprepared for betrayal. "You lied to her. You told her I would burn the syndicate to ash chasing her, and you let her believe leaving was the only way to save me, when the truth is you needed her gone to protect your own leverage with the Choi family. I am telling you now because Min-jae has grown bolder than I anticipated, and I fear what he intends is no longer about territory. I fear it has become personal in a way business alliances cannot control. Get out of my building, Soo-jin. You have until morning to explain yourself to the council, or I will explain it for you, and I promise my version will not be kind." Daisy said nothing until the office door closed, and then she sank into the leather chair across from Tae-min's desk, staring at her own hands like they belonged to a stranger. 3 years, she said finally. 3 years of thinking I was strong enough to survive losing you for the right reasons. And it turns out I was just a pawn in someone else's old grudge. You survived it either way. That part was never a lie. You built an entire life out of nothing, in a country that wasn't yours, speaking a language you had to learn from scratch, and you did it while carrying a grief most people would have let destroy them. Whatever Su Jin's reasons, that strength was always yours. The third betrayal arrived dressed as an olive branch. Choi Min-jae requested, through impeccably polite legal channels, a private dinner meeting at a restaurant of his choosing in the Busan waterfront district, framed publicly as an attempt to broker peace between two syndicates whose ongoing tension had begun to worry the Underworld Council's other families, who feared a full territorial war would draw unwanted attention from the National Police's organized crime unit. Tae-min refused to let Daisy anywhere near it. She went anyway, slipping out through the restaurant's kitchen delivery entrance, while Do-yoon was momentarily distracted because she had spent 3 years learning to make her own decisions, and she refused to spend the rest of her life hiding behind a man's protection like she was made of something breakable. The restaurant Min-jae had chosen sat directly across from the docks where Tae-min had once bled into her waiting hands, all dark wood, and low lighting and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking cargo cranes lit up like skeletal giants against the night sky. Min-jae rose when she entered alone, a slow smile spreading across his face like oil across water. "Miss Reyes, I confess I expected the chairman, not his favorite pastry chef. He doesn't know I'm here." Bold, foolish but bold. I admire it. Please, sit. I promise you, whatever stories you've been told about me, I am simply a businessman protecting what is owed to my family. What exactly do you believe's owed to you? Min-jae's smile sharpened, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret between old friends. 20 years ago, your Tae-min's father made a promise to mine, a 50-year lease on the northern docks in exchange for my family standing down during a succession dispute that would have otherwise torn the entire peninsula's underworld apart. Kang Sung-ho took the peace, he took the territory, and when the ink dried, he tore up the agreement and had my father quietly removed from the council within a year, publicly disgraced on fabricated charges of smuggling that even the police privately admit were manufactured. I do not want you, Miss Reyes. You are, and always have been, a means to an end. I want the docks that were stolen from my family, and I have learned that the fastest way to bring a proud man to a negotiating table is to make him remember exactly how much he still has left to lose. Daisy sat very still, absorbing the shape of a war she never asked to be part of, built on a foundation laid decades before she was even born, and understood with sudden, sickening clarity that leaving 3 years ago was never going to save anyone from this. The war was always coming. She was only ever a delay tactic in someone else's inevitable collision course. Then negotiate with him directly. Stop using me as a hostage in a conversation that has nothing to do with me. Oh, Miss Reyes, Min-jae said softly, his eyes glinting with something colder than amusement. But it has everything to do with you now. You didn't just make him fall in love with you 3 years ago. Tonight, in front of 300 witnesses and a dozen cameras, you made him weak in public. And weakness, in our world, is not a private failing. It is an invitation. The fourth betrayal, the cruelest, arrived before she even made it back to the car. Her phone buzzed with a text from a number she did not recognize, a single photograph attached, and when it loaded, the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. It was a picture of her mother's small house in Ohio, taken from across the street, time-stamped 4 hours earlier, with a caption in flawless English that made her blood run cold. Distance did not protect her either. She did not remember the drive back to Kang Tower. She remembered Tae-min's face when Do-yoon finally located her in the lobby, the barely controlled fury in his eyes replaced instantly by something rawer, more frightened, when he saw her own face drained of all color, phone shaking in her outstretched hand. He knows about my mother. Taemin's jaw set into a line of pure, cold resolve, the same look Daisy imagined a general wore the exact moment he stopped trying to avoid a war and started trying to win one. Then it's time he learns exactly what happens when he threatens the wrong woman's family. By midnight, Taemin had 3 private security teams deployed to Ohio, a chartered flight fueled, and waiting to bring Daisy's mother to Seoul under armed protection whether she wanted to come or not, and a phone call placed to every syndicate family on the Underworld Council, informing them, in language too polite to be anything but a declaration of war, that Choi Min-jae had broken the single rule every family in the country had honored for 2 generations. He had brought civilians, ordinary people with no stake in this world, directly into the blast radius. And in the Underworld's oldest and only truly sacred law, that was a line no council in the country would forgive being crossed, which meant that, for the first time in 3 years, Kang Taemin was no longer fighting this war alone. The council met at dawn in a private room on the 30th floor of a hotel none of them owned on paper, though every family in the room knew Taemin's holding company quietly controlled the building through 4 layers of shell corporations, a fact he had never bothered correcting because a man who controls the room does not need to announce that he owns the walls. 7 syndicate heads sat around a lacquered black table, the elders of families whose grandfathers had carved up this country's underworld in the smoking rubble after the war, and for the first time in a generation, every one of them looked at Kang Taemin the way soldiers look at a general who has just proven he was never actually retreating, only reloading. He stood at the head of the table with Daisy seated beside him, her hand steady in his, despite the sleepless night etched beneath her eyes, and he began to speak in the flat, unhurried cadence of a man who had already won and was simply waiting for the room to catch up to the fact. 3 years ago, when I learned that Daisy Reyes had disappeared, I was told a story about a broken heart and a woman who chose to walk away. I believed that story for exactly 6 months. Then Do-yoon brought me evidence that the Choi family had threatened her life to force her departure, and I understood I had not lost a woman to heartbreak. I had lost her to extortion, and I made a decision that night that I have kept from every person in this room, including the woman sitting beside me, until this very moment. He gestured to Do-yoon, who stepped forward and placed a folder on the black table, sliding it toward the elders with the ceremonial gravity of a man laying down a winning hand. Inside were stock transfer documents, Shell Corporation filings, and shipping manifests spanning 3 years, quietly compiled, quietly executed, never once triggering a single alarm in Choi Min-jae's organization, because Taemin never bought anything directly. He bought debt. Small, unremarkable slivers of Choi family debt scattered across a dozen shadow lenders, restaurant leases, and dockside storage contracts, each purchase innocuous on its own, invisible in isolation, until 3 years of patient accumulation quietly consolidated into something none of them had ever anticipated. I do not merely compete with the Choi family shipping operation. As of 11 months ago, through 11 separate holding entities, I legally owned 61% of it. The silence that followed was total. Even the elder from the Yoon family, a woman in her 80s who had outlived 4 husbands and 2 wars and was famously impossible to surprise, set down her teacup with an audible clink of genuine shock. The warehouse's men used to store the accelerant they intended to burn my restaurant's kitchen down with, Daisy said quietly, understanding arriving in real time, her voice hollowed by the scale of what she was only now beginning to grasp. That's yours too, isn't it? It has been for 14 months. Min-jae has spent 3 years believing he was quietly building leverage against a distracted, weakened rival. In reality, he has spent 3 years operating almost entirely inside a structure I already own, funding a war using resources whose true ownership he never bothered to verify because he assumed a heartbroken man, too consumed with finding a lost love, would never notice the ground shifting beneath him. He was almost right. If I had found Daisy sooner, I might have moved against him quietly, through corporate maneuvering alone, no bloodshed, no scandal. But last night, he threatened a civilian who has never once held a weapon or worn our world's colors. He photographed her mother's house in another country and sent it as a warning. That single act broke the only law every family at this table has upheld for 2 generations, and it means I am no longer required to be quiet about anything. The elder from the Yoon family spoke first, her voice thin with age but iron underneath. The council will not protect a man who threatens civilians. That has never been in question since the Accord of 1998. What is the punishment you propose, Chairman Kang? I propose nothing, Tae-min said. I have already set it in motion. In 1 hour, the Busan Financial Crimes Division will receive an anonymous tip regarding irregular shell company activity connected to a warehouse fire attempt and an intimidation campaign targeting a private American citizen, evidence that traces cleanly back to Choi Min-jae's known associates without implicating this council or anyone in this room. I am not asking Min-jae to answer to us. I am handing him to the one authority even our world cannot buy its way out of indefinitely. And as of this morning, effective immediately, I am exercising my controlling shareholder rights to dissolve every shipping contract the Choi family currently holds through the entities I now own, which I estimate will collapse roughly 70% of their operating revenue within the week. Across the table, the elder from the Choi family's oldest rival house allowed himself the smallest, coldest smile Daisy had ever seen on a human face. Then it seems, Chairman Kang, that you did not come to this council today for permission. You came to inform us the war is already finished, and you are simply extending the courtesy of letting us watch the final move. It was precisely at that moment, as if summoned by his own downfall, that Do-yoon's earpiece crackled with an alert that drained the color from his face and sent him striding urgently toward Tae-min's side, murmuring 3 words that shattered the room's fragile order entirely. He's at the docks. Choi Min-jae, apparently informed within minutes by a mole somewhere inside the financial crimes tip line, had driven directly to the Busan warehouse himself, the same warehouse where 3 years earlier Tae-min first bled into Daisy's hands, and according to the security footage now streaming into Do-yoon's tablet, he was not alone. He had brought 6 armed men and a single hostage. A terrified young courier from the Marigold supply chain snatched off a delivery route an hour earlier, apparently intended as insurance, the moment his empire began visibly crumbling around him. Tae-min was already moving before the council could finish reacting, Daisy half a step behind him despite Do-yoon's sharp warning that she stay behind in protective custody, a suggestion she dismissed with a single flat look that reminded Tae-min exactly why he fell in love with her in the first place. I stitched you up once in an alley with a sewing needle, Tae-min. I am not sitting in a hotel room drinking tea while you walk into a warehouse full of guns. The rain had not stopped over Busan. It fell in cold silver sheets across the docks as 3 black SUVs pulled into the warehouse district, cargo cranes looming overhead like skeletal sentinels against a bruised gray sky. The same cranes that had watched over Daisy and Tae-min's very first meeting 3 years earlier, now bearing witness to whatever the story became next. Do-yoon deployed 12 men in a perimeter before Tae-min ever stepped out of the vehicle, and by the time he walked through the warehouse's rolling steel door, cold and controlled despite the storm inside his chest, Choi Min-jae was waiting for him beneath a bare hanging bulb, a pistol resting loosely in his hand, his silver scorpion cufflinks catching the dim light like tiny malevolent eyes. You destroyed 3 years of careful work in a single council meeting, Min-jae said, his voice stretched thin over something that sounded almost like admiration wrapped around fury. I have to respect the patience it took. I truly do. But respect does not pay my men, Tae-min, and it does not restore my family's dignity, and it certainly does not undo the fact that you have systematically dismantled everything I have built since I was old enough to understand what my father lost to yours. Let the courier go, Min-jae. This is between us. It always was. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it became about her the moment you kissed her in front of 300 witnesses and made it impossible for either of us to pretend otherwise. The young courier, bound and terrified in the corner, chose that exact moment to make a desperate lunge for the warehouse's side exit, and in the chaos of that single unplanned second, everything happened at once. One of Min-jae's men fired a warning shot that went wide and shattered a hanging light fixture, plunging half the warehouse into shadow. Do-yoon's perimeter team breached through both the front and rear entrances simultaneously, the sound of a dozen boots against wet concrete thundering through the dark, and Daisy, who had been explicitly told to remain in the vehicle, was instead already crouched beside the terrified courier, shielding the younger woman's body with her own broad, solid frame, refusing to move even as gunfire cracked somewhere behind her, because some instincts, she would later realize, were simply louder than fear. Tae-min did not draw a weapon. He had not carried one in 3 years, a private penance he never explained to anyone, and he did not reach for one now. Instead, he crossed the warehouse floor directly toward Min-jae, with his hands open and visible, walking into the barrel of a loaded gun, with the flat, terrifying calm of a man who had already calculated every version of this moment and decided none of them ended with him flinching first. "You could end this right now. Pull the trigger. Take everything from me the way you believe I've taken everything from you. But you will still be a man with a collapsed empire, a criminal record the police already have half built, and a family name that will spend the next 50 years synonymous with the day the Choi heir shot an unarmed man in front of national police who are, at this very moment, 6 minutes out from this exact location." Min-jae's hand trembled, the gun wavering, 3 years of rage and inherited grievance and desperate cornered pride, all fighting for control of a single finger against a single trigger, and for one suspended, silent moment, the entire warehouse seemed to hold its breath along with him. It was Daisy's voice that broke the standoff, not Tae-min's. She rose from where she had been shielding the courier, rain-soaked and furious, and entirely unafraid in a way that surprised even her, and called across the warehouse floor in clear, steady Korean she had spent 3 years teaching herself specifically so she would never again be a woman who did not understand the language of her own life. "He didn't steal your father's dignity, Min-jae. Your father lost it the moment he let a broken promise become the only story he ever told you. You've spent your whole life avenging a wound that was never actually about you, and now you're about to become exactly the kind of cautionary tale you swore you'd never let your family name become. Put the gun down. Not for him. For yourself." Whether it was her words, or the distant approaching wail of sirens now audible even over the rain drumming against the warehouse's tin roof, or simply the final exhausted collapse of 3 years spent carrying a grievance too heavy for any one man to hold alone, something in Min-jae's shoulders broke. The gun lowered. Do-yoon's men closed the distance and disarmed him without further resistance. And by the time the Busan police flooded through the warehouse's rolling door with weapons drawn and radios crackling, Choi Min-jae was already on his knees on the wet concrete, hands laced behind his head, staring at nothing, a man watching the last shape of his father's legacy dissolve into evidence bags and handcuffs. The fallout arrived fast and total, the way collapses in the underworld always do once the first support beam finally gives way. Within 72 hours, financial crimes investigators uncovered a paper trail linking Choi Min-jae directly to arson conspiracy, international intimidation of a foreign national, and unregistered weapons charges serious enough that even his family's most expensive legal counsel privately admitted there was no version of this that ended in anything less than a decade behind bars. The Underworld Council, invoking the Accord of 1998 with unanimous and unusual speed, formally stripped the Choi family of its seat entirely, redistributing what remained of their legitimate shipping contracts among 3 smaller families who had waited generations for exactly this kind of opening. Choi Min-jae's own father, informed of his son's downfall from a hospital bed where he had spent the last 2 years recovering from a stroke, reportedly said only 4 words to the family lawyer who delivered the news: "I told him patience." And in a modest 2-bedroom house outside Columbus, Ohio, Daisy's mother, Linda Reyes, 61 years old and utterly unaware for 3 years that her daughter's disappearance from Korea had anything to do with organized crime, finished packing a suitcase under the quiet, respectful supervision of Tae-min's security team, muttering the entire time about how she always knew that girl was hiding something the size of a small country, and demanding, the moment she landed in Seoul red-eyed and jet-lagged, to know exactly which one of these men her daughter intended to marry, because, at her age, She had no patience left for slow romantic subplots. That night, long after the police tape had been strung across the warehouse door, and the last of Do Yoon's men had finished their reports, Taemin found Daisy sitting alone on the same stretch of dock where the cargo cranes still loomed overhead like patient iron giants, her knees pulled to her chest, rain finally softening into a fine mist that clung to her curls and beaded along her bare arms. He sat down beside her without a word, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all, because some nights do not need narration, only company. "I keep thinking about the version of tonight where you didn't walk toward him with your hands empty," she said finally, her voice rough from adrenaline that had only just begun to drain out of her, where he panicked and pulled the trigger before the police ever got close enough to matter. "I have spent 3 years grieving a version of you I invented to survive losing you. I don't think I could survive burying the real one. You won't have to." He turned to face her fully, his fingers finding hers in the damp dark, thumb tracing slow, absent circles over her knuckles, the way he used to when they sat on an overturned crate behind a noodle stall a lifetime ago. "I built an empire so large and so careful specifically so I would never again have to gamble with someone I loved. Tonight was the last time. I promise you that, not as the chairman of anything, just as a man sitting on a dock in the rain with the only person who has ever made him want to survive his own life instead of merely dominate it." She laughed, wet and startled, wiping her face with the back of her hand. That might be the least romantic proposal-adjacent sentence I have ever heard, and somehow it still made my chest hurt. "I have 3 years of terrible romantic instincts to make up for. Give me time. You have the rest of your life, apparently, since I'm clearly never getting rid of you now." He pressed his lips to her temple, then to the corner of her mouth, slow and unhurried, nothing at all like the desperate, cinematic kiss that had detonated across a ballroom full of strangers 24 hours earlier. This kiss belonged only to them, quiet and certain, built from 3 years of longing, finally allowed to exhale. "I need you to know something," she said against his jaw, her voice steadying with each word. "I am not the same woman who left in the middle of the night 3 years ago, too afraid to even leave a note. I spent 3 years building a life that didn't need rescuing, and I am not interested in becoming someone who only exists in the shadow of your protection. If we do this, whatever this becomes, I need it to be two people standing shoulder to shoulder, not one man shielding one woman from a world he refuses to let her understand." Taemin was quiet for a moment, turning her words over with the same careful weight he gave every negotiation that actually mattered, and when he finally answered, there was no hesitation in it at all. "Then, let's build it that way. No more secrets kept out of some misguided idea of protection. No more decisions made on your behalf by people who claim to love you more than they trust you. I dissolved the syndicate's criminal infrastructure this morning, in the same meeting where I exposed Min Jae, though I hadn't planned to tell you until the paperwork finalized. I don't want an empire that requires me to lie to the person I love in order to keep her safe. I want a life ordinary enough that the biggest danger in it is whether the croissants sell out before 10. Daisy stared at him for a long moment, rain misting silver in the dock lights behind him, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 straight years finally, fully unclenched. "You're serious? You're actually going to walk away from all of it?" "I already have. What's left is simply the part where I get to find out who I am when I'm not constantly bracing for the next attack. I'd like to find that out with you if you'll have me. Flower on my sleeves and all." She kissed him again, laughing against his mouth this time, the sound of it carrying out over the dark water where cargo ships sat at anchor like sleeping giants, indifferent to the small, enormous thing happening on the dock beneath them. Somewhere behind them, Do Yoon, watching from a respectful distance with the faint, exhausted smile of a man who had spent 3 years waiting for exactly this outcome, quietly radioed the rest of the security team to stand down for the night, because for the first time since he was assigned to protect Kang Tae-min, the most dangerous thing in the vicinity was simply two people finally allowing themselves to be happy. 1 year later, the roof of a small building in Ixionddong had been transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to either of them 3 years earlier. back when a handful of cracked terracotta pots and two young lovers with nothing but stolen hours were the only things growing there. Now the rooftop belonged to a bakery called Little Moon, its sign painted by hand in warm gold script, its windows fogged with the steam of fresh bread every morning at 6, its rooftop garden overflowing with the same variety of roses Daisy and Taman had planted together on a different roof in a different city a lifetime ago. Thorns and all, exactly the way his mother once told him something worth protecting always grows. Daisy Bellamy Reyes owned Little Moon outright, funded not by Kang money, which she had refused on principle for 11 straight months, until Taman finally understood that letting her build this one thing entirely with her own two hands mattered more than any amount of capital he could offer, but by 3 years of saved wages, a modest business loan she had qualified for on her own credit history, and a reputation built dessert by painstaking dessert at the Marigold, before she left to open a door of her own, the kind of door she had always told him she dreamed of, warm enough that nobody walking through it would ever have to be afraid. She was not thin, she had never needed to be. She stood behind her own counter most mornings in a flour-dusted apron, with her curls tied back and her sleeves pushed up, her broad, capable hands turning butter and sugar into small architectural miracles. And when tourists occasionally whispered behind their hands about the size of the woman running the city's most talked-about pastry counter, her regular customers, and there were hundreds of them now, were quick to inform the whisperers that they should try the salted caramel tart before they said another word, because genius, it turned out, did not apologize for the space it took up in the world. Kang Tae-min visited every single morning at exactly 7:15, without fail, security detail waiting discreetly across the street, and ordered the same thing he had ordered since the bakery's opening week, a plain butter croissant and an Americano too strong for most people's taste, and sat at the small corner table by the window doing actual paperwork like a man who had learned, slowly and against every instinct his upbringing hammered into him, that an empire can survive an hour of stillness every morning if it means watching the woman he loves work with her hands. The Baco Syndicate no longer existed in name. 6 months after the warehouse standoff, in a move that stunned the Underworld Council more thoroughly than his 100 million won bid ever did, Tae-min formally dissolved the criminal infrastructure his family had built across 3 generations, converting every legitimate shipping and logistics asset into a fully transparent public company now traded, audited, and taxed like any other conglomerate in the country. He kept the throne. He simply burned the crown that came with it. Not every family on the council approved. Several openly called it reckless, naive, a betrayal of a legacy built in blood and patience. But Tae-min told the room, in the same flat, unhurried voice he used the morning he dismantled Choi Min-jae's entire operation, that he had spent 3 years learning the difference between power that protects the people you love and power that simply protects itself, and he no longer had any interest in the second kind. Choi Min-jae was serving the 4th year of a 12-year sentence in a federal facility outside Daegu, stripped of every asset his family once controlled, visited exactly once by his father before the older man's death 8 months earlier, a visit during which, according to the one guard willing to discuss it years later, the elder Choi said nothing at all, simply sat across from his son in silence for the full allotted hour before rising and walking out without a backward glance, leaving Min-jae alone with the exact inheritance of pride and silence that had started this entire war 2 generations earlier. He wrote letters occasionally, addressed to no one, that his lawyer said he never sent. In them, according to rumors that eventually reached even Do-yoon's careful ears, he wrote mostly about a warehouse near the docks, and rain, and a woman's voice telling him, in careful, self-taught Korean, that he had been avenging a wound that was never actually his to carry. Han Soo-jin had been formally removed from her position as strategist within a week of her confession, exiled from the inner circle she had served for 2 decades, though Tae-min, in a decision that surprised even himself, declined to pursue any legal or financial retaliation against her. choosing instead to let her walk away with her dignity mostly intact, a mercy she never expected, and had apparently spent the last year trying to earn retroactively through quiet, anonymous donations to the same Incheon orphanage the original charity gala was meant to benefit. She and Daisy had spoken exactly once since, a brief and careful conversation over tea that ended with an apology neither woman fully believed was enough, but that both agreed was, at minimum, a beginning. Linda Reyes did not in fact return to Ohio. She fell in love with Seoul within 3 weeks, opened a modest English tutoring business out of a converted studio 2 blocks from Little Moon, and appointed herself the bakery's unofficial and extremely opinionated taste tester, a role she performed with the same stubborn devotion she had once poured into raising a daughter who refused, against every expectation placed on her, to shrink herself to fit anyone else's comfort. And on a clear October evening, exactly 1 year to the day after 100 million won kiss detonated across a Gangnam ballroom, Kang Tae-min closed Little Moon's front door behind the last customer, flipped the small handwritten sign to read closed, and got down on one knee on the same rooftop where roses now climbed wild and unbothered along a weathered trellis, holding out a ring set with a single stone, the exact deep green of the dress Daisy had worn the night he found her again, and asked her, in front of no cameras, no counsel, no ballroom full of strangers, only the two of them, and a rooftop full of thorns and blossoms they had grown back together with their own patient hands, to marry him. She said yes before he finished the sentence, laughing through tears the way she had finally learned, 3 years and a lifetime of careful healing later, that she was allowed to cry in front of someone without it costing her a single thing. Loyalty built on fear will always eventually collapse under its own weight, but loyalty built on the courage to be fully known, flaws, softness, scars, and all, is the only kind of empire that ever survives the storm.